The wind cut through the frozen Montana plains like a blade, howling across the emptiness with a bitter, lonely cry. Hank Rowley pulled his old pickup truck to the side of the road, the tires crunching over ice. Something in the distance had caught his eye, a shape, dark and unmoving, against the endless white. He stepped out slowly, his breath curling in front of him, boots sinking into the snow with each step. At 67, Hank had seen enough winters to know when something wasn't right. And this felt wrong from the moment he laid eyes on it. Two horses stood in the snow, or rather, one stood. The other had collapsed, its legs tucked awkwardly beneath its large, shivering body. Both were coated in a light dusting of frost, their thick winter coats doing little to hide the exhaustion in their eyes. Most disturbing of all were the heavy black chains that bound them together, dragging across the ground like prison shackles. Hank froze, his weathered face tightening. Horses didn't just end up like this. Someone had done this to them, and recently. He approached slowly, talking under his breath in that low, calming tone only old ranchers seemed to master. "Easy now," he muttered. The standing horse, a big, muscular bay with a white blaze, snorted but didn't back away. The other, lying down, barely moved. Its eyes fluttered open, cloudy and tired, but locked onto Hank with something deeper than fear. There was sadness there. Regret, even. It unsettled him. Animals didn't usually look at people like that, like they were asking for forgiveness. Kneeling beside the fallen horse, Hank reached out and gently brushed snow from its neck. That's when he saw it, a small, metal tag pressed against the animal's skin, half frozen in place. He scraped at it with his thumbnail until the numbers came into view. It wasn't a ranch brand, it was a serial number. Clean, deliberate, and deeply out of place. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. These weren't just lost horses. He stood up, glancing around the empty field, heart pounding louder than the wind. What the hell was going on out here? These horses didn't belong in the wild, they belonged somewhere else. Somewhere structured. Controlled. The kind of place where animals got tagged like inventory. And if they'd run, what were they running from? Just then, the standing horse pulled gently on the chain, looking Hank dead in the eyes. It wasn't panic. It was a plea. For help. Or for silence. The storm crept in fast. Snow began falling harder now, swirling in wild circles as the temperature dropped. Hank knew he didn't have long. He couldn't just leave them there, not chained, not exposed. The lying horse, he'd later name him Dusty, let out a low, hoarse breath. Hank crouched again, this time examining the chain itself. Thick, industrial-grade links. This wasn't a rancher's rope job. It was something meant to hold weight, control movement, prevent escape. Pulling a bolt cutter from the back of his truck, Hank returned with urgency. The wind whipped at his face, turning his cheeks raw and red. He gritted his teeth as he wedged the jaws of the cutter around one of the links, pressing down with all his might. The metal groaned, resisted, then finally gave way with a sharp crack. The tension in the horses' bodies shifted immediately. Dusty didn't rise, but he exhaled again, slower this time, as if aware that something had changed. Hank worked quickly, freeing them both. As soon as the second chain hit the snow, the standing horse, a larger, more muscular one with a wild look in his eyes, stepped forward and lowered his head toward Dusty. The connection between them was unmistakable. Brothers, maybe. Or something closer. Hank had seen that kind of bond before. It didn't come from training. It came from surviving something. Together. As the wind howled louder, Hank had to make a decision. He couldn't load both horses into the truck bed, not without risking injury. But leaving them wasn't an option. He walked back to the cab and grabbed an old wool blanket, then returned to Dusty, laying it over his back. "You hang on," he muttered, almost to himself. Then he turned to the standing horse. You're coming with me." The horse didn't resist, as if he understood. He led the stronger horse, now named Bandit in his mind, to the truck, securing him carefully before climbing into the driver's seat. The heater sputtered to life, blowing weak air onto Hank's frozen fingers. His eyes went back to Dusty, still lying in the snow, the blanket barely moving with his breath. Hank didn't know why, but he felt it in his gut. This wasn't just about rescuing two lost animals. Something about those chains. That tag. The way Bandit had looked at him. They weren't just asking to be saved. They were hiding from something, or someone. The snow had nearly erased the road by the time Hank reached the barn. The old structure groaned under the weight of the storm, its wood creaking like a ship in rough waters. He pulled the truck as close as he could, stepped out into the cold, and led Bandit inside. The big horse hesitated only for a second before entering, as if he'd done this before. Too many times. Hank threw some old hay into a stall and gave Bandit water, then ran back out to check on Dusty. The blanket was barely holding on. Dusty hadn't moved an inch, but his eyes were still open. Barely. Hank knelt beside him again, whispering softly, "I know, boy. I know you're tired. But you gotta trust me." He grabbed an old sled he used for firewood and gently rolled the horse onto it, inch by inch. It wasn't easy. Dusty was heavy, and Hank's back ached from years of hard labor, but something inside him pushed harder than the pain. Something he couldn't name yet. Inside the barn, Hank got Dusty into a stall next to Bandit, covering him with more blankets and checking his legs for signs of injury. There were scars, faint but long, and deep patches where the fur had worn away completely. Hank's breath caught in his throat. These weren't scratches from barbed wire or a scuffle. They looked deliberate, repetitive, as if someone had been keeping him tied down for a long time. He stepped back, hands on his knees, catching his breath. Bandit stood in the next stall, head low, ears forward, watching him closely. There was something unsettling about the way the horse watched every move. Not in fear, not even in gratitude. It was almost protective, like he was waiting to see if Hank could be trusted, or maybe trying to decide if he'd have to protect Dusty again. Just then, a loud snap echoed from outside. Hank turned fast, instinctively reaching for the old rifle he kept by the barn door. When he stepped outside, the wind had started to die down, but something was wrong. In the snow near the road, faint but unmistakable, were tire tracks. Fresh ones. Leading in, then stopping, and turning back the way they came. No footprints. No sign of a driver. Just a silent, deliberate U-turn. Someone had been watching. And whoever it was, they hadn't planned on being seen. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle silence and thick snow piled along the fences. Hank hadn't slept. He'd spent most of the night in the barn, checking on the horses every hour. Dusty was breathing easier now, still weak, but alive. Bandit hadn't left his side once. The way the two leaned into each other, even in sleep, reminded Hank of soldiers returning from battle, closer than blood. With the sunlight, details became clearer. Hank examined the metal tag again, brushing off dried mud and ice. The number etched into it was simple but cold, 0198HR. He jotted it down on a scrap of paper, not sure why, but something about the letters struck him. HR. His own initials. Hank Rowley. It was probably a coincidence. Had to be, but still, it felt like a knock on a door he hadn't opened in decades. Later that afternoon, he drove into town to visit Dr. Elijah Foster, the local vet. Elijah had been tending to livestock in Red Hill for over 30 years, and if anyone could make sense of the scars and the tag, it was him. The vet adjusted his glasses, studying the notes Hank had brought. His expression darkened. "This isn't a ranching ID," he said quietly. "These numbers, they look military." or government. I've seen something like it once before, a long time ago. But not in horses. Hank frowned. What kind of operation uses serial numbers like that on animals? Elijah hesitated, then leaned in. There was talk back in the early 2000s. Rumors about a research program, behavioral conditioning, enhanced performance, even emotional testing. They used wild mustangs. But it was shut down. Or it was supposed to be. He looked Hank straight in the eye. Where did you say you found them? Hank didn't answer right away. He stared out the clinic window, his mind drifting to a place he hadn't allowed himself to visit in years, a part of his past buried deep beneath layers of guilt and silence. A name echoed in his head, Sherman Lowe. A man who once owned land just north of Hank's property. A man with ties to government contracts, and a barn that had always been locked from the outside. Back in the truck, Hank gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles white. He wasn't just trying to protect 2 horses anymore. He was chasing ghosts. And they were closer than he thought. The drive to the old Lowe property was short but heavy with unease. Snow crunched beneath Hank's tires as he followed the barely visible path that wound behind a hill lined with dead trees. No one had lived there in years, not since Sherman Lowe vanished without warning nearly a decade ago. Locals said he'd moved to Arizona. Others claimed he'd been involved in something shady, but no one ever proved anything. Hank hadn't thought about the man in years. Until now. The barn stood like a ghost. Weather-beaten, gray, its roof sagging under years of neglect. But one thing hadn't changed. The padlock. Still there, still intact. Hank climbed out of his truck and approached it slowly, heart pounding like a drum. The air smelled of rust and frozen earth. With a deep breath, he yanked the bolt cutters from behind the seat and clamped them around the lock. It snapped with less resistance than he expected. The door creaked open with a moan that echoed across the empty property. Inside, the air was dry and musty, filled with the scent of hay long since rotted. And then Hank saw them, old cages, metal, reinforced, large enough for horses. Each had numbers spray-painted in white on the sides. 0196 HR, 0197 HR, 0198 HR. His stomach turned. The last one matched Dusty's tag. On the far wall, dusty folders were stacked on a rusted table. Hank picked one up with shaking hands. Inside were charts, behavioral notes, injection records, and photographs. Photographs of the very horses now in his barn. Some images showed Bandit rearing up, blindfolded, surrounded by men in lab coats. Others showed Dusty hooked up to wires, with terrified eyes and visible ribs. These weren't just wild horses. They'd been used, studied, trained, pushed to their limits. Hank backed away, bile rising in his throat. Why here? Why had this been allowed to happen so close to his land, and without his knowing? Or had he always known, deep down? There had been nights years ago when he'd heard strange sounds echoing through the trees. He'd ignored them, dismissed them, told himself it wasn't his business. Now it was. As he stepped outside, a shadow moved at the tree line. A figure, tall, coat billowing, watching from a distance. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared. Hank didn't chase, because deep down, he already knew who it was, and what they were coming back for. Hank drove home with his fists clenched around the steering wheel, the folders from the barn resting on the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. His thoughts raced. Each photo, each chart, it wasn't just documentation. It was evidence of cruelty, of a cover-up, of something far bigger than a legal experimentation. And somehow, it all happened within miles of his own land. Maybe even with his silent permission. The barn was warm when he returned. Bandit stood tall, ears flicking as Hank entered, but Dusty was now standing, weak, trembling, but upright. Hank knelt beside him, whispering, "Good boy. You're safe now." He placed one hand gently on Dusty's shoulder, and for a brief moment the horse closed his eyes and leaned in. It was more than exhaustion. It was trust. A small, broken creature finding comfort again. And Hank felt something crack open in his chest, a grief he hadn't known he was carrying. He returned to the house, spread the documents across the old kitchen table, and began reading. Names jumped out at him: lab technicians, equipment providers, and one name underlined multiple times: Tommy Rowley. His son. Hank's breath caught. His fingers trembled as he picked up the page. Tommy had worked for a defense contractor in his 20s, back when father and son still spoke. They had argued about ethics, about responsibility. Tommy had said things Hank never forgot, about using animals for controlled emotional response studies, about making them more reliable than soldiers. Hank had assumed it was theory. Talk. He hadn't known Tommy had been part of this. A knock at the door jolted him. It wasn't a neighbor's knock. It was deliberate, heavy, cautious. He opened it slowly, rifle leaning against the wall behind him. Standing there, in a thick coat and snow-covered boots, was a man with tired eyes and a familiar jawline. Tommy. Older now, harder, but still his son. "Dad," Tommy said quietly, avoiding his eyes. "We need to talk." Hank didn't answer. Not right away. He studied his son's face, the regret, the tension. But beneath it all, something else. Fear. And Hank realized something he hadn't considered before. Tommy wasn't just here to confess. He was here because someone was coming. And they weren't far behind. Hank didn't invite Tommy in. He simply stepped aside, silently, and let the cold wind push his son across the threshold. The door closed behind them with a solid thud, cutting off the world outside, but not the weight hanging in the air between them. Tommy glanced around the kitchen, his eyes landing on the documents spread across the table. He exhaled slowly. "So, you know." Hank crossed his arms, voice low and steady. "I know enough. I know Dusty and Bandit weren't just strays. I know you were involved. And I know whatever this was, it was never meant to end well." Tommy sat down heavily, his shoulders slumped like a man carrying decades of regret. "It started with good intentions. We were building trauma response units. Horses trained to assist in crisis zones, war zones, therapy, logistics, even battlefield support. They were smarter than anyone expected. Too smart. Then funding shifted. They started doing things without oversight. Pain tolerance trials. Sleep deprivation. Isolation. We tried to shut it down, some of us did, but Sherman, he kept it going in private. Off the grid." Hank's jaw tightened. "On land next to mine. And you let him." "I didn't know, not until years later," Tommy snapped, eyes suddenly burning. "And by then it was too late. The horses were gone. Destroyed, or so I thought. But a few got away. 2 of them, specifically. The last test subjects. They were smarter than the rest. They remembered. They resisted. Sherman tried to dispose of them last week, but they broke free." He looked up, pain raw in his voice. "And now they're yours." Hank's heart pounded in his chest. Dusty and Bandit weren't just survivors. They were living records of everything Tommy had once helped build, and everything he had failed to stop. "Why now?" Hank asked. "Why come back?" "Because Sherman's not done," Tommy said. "He's got men looking for them. And if he finds them, he'll erase them. And anyone helping them." A long silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of wind scratching at the windows. Hank didn't need time to think. He looked toward the barn, toward the place where those 2 broken souls were finally starting to rest. Then he turned back to his son. "Then we protect them," Hank said. "And we finish what you should have started years ago." The warning came not in words, but in silence. The kind that settles before something terrible happens. Around midnight, the wind died, and with it, every sound from the forest. Hank stood on the porch with his rifle, watching the tree line like a hawk. Tommy was inside, gathering supplies, flashlight batteries, an old revolver, canned food. He knew what was coming. And it wasn't just about the horses anymore. It was about finishing a mistake that had taken years to admit. They'd boarded the barn doors, reinforced the stalls, and locked the gate. Dusty and Bandit sensed it too. They were restless, shifting, eyes wide, ears pinned back. Bandit paced his stall like a soldier waiting for the breach. Dusty stayed close to the far wall, body still recovering but heart fully alert. Hank paused for a second to watch them, not as animals, but as survivors. Fighters. Victims of something dark, and smarter than anyone had believed. Then the headlights appeared, two sets, slowly creeping down the unpaved road, cutting through the snow like knives. No sound. No engines revving. Just the crunch of tires and the chill of certainty. Hank raised his rifle. Tommy stepped beside him with the revolver, loaded and ready. For a brief second, they stood together. Father and son, fractured for years, now bound by something bigger than blood, redemption. The truck stopped just outside the gate. Two figures stepped out, dressed in black, heavy coats, earpieces visible. Government? Mercenaries? Hank couldn't tell. One of them pulled a flashlight and shined it toward the barn. "We're here for the animals," he said, voice flat, practiced. "They belong to a government program. Unauthorized possession is a federal offense." Hank stepped forward, rifle still pointed low but firm. "They're not property. They're not machines. They're victims. And they're not leaving this land." He expected fear. Maybe hesitation. What he saw instead was the man nodding to his partner. No negotiations. Just procedure. Then everything happened at once. Tommy fired first, a warning shot into the snow. The flash from the muzzle lit the trees. The men ducked, shouting into radios. From inside the barn, Bandit let out a shrill, guttural cry, and Dusty began stomping wildly, kicking the stall walls. The noise was deafening. Chaos had arrived, and with it, the fight to decide who controlled the truth. And for the first time in decades, Hank Rowley chose to stand and face it. The gunfire didn't last long. It wasn't a full firefight. Just sharp, short exchanges. But that was enough. The horses were panicked, slamming against the stall doors. Hank crouched behind the truck, reloading his rifle with shaky hands, sweat freezing on his brow despite the cold. Tommy was pinned behind the barn, shouting over the wind. The intruders were advancing slowly, calculatingly, as if they knew how far they could push before things turned truly lethal. Then came the breaking sound, wood shattering, iron snapping. One of the stall doors had given in. Bandit burst through, wild-eyed and furious. He didn't run away. He charged straight into the open, hoofs thundering against the frozen ground. One of the men turned his weapon toward him. "No!" Hank screamed, rising to his feet. But it was too late. A shot fired, echoing like thunder. Bandit didn't fall. The horse dodged like a trained warrior, circling the man, then rearing high with an ear-splitting scream. The man dropped his weapon, tripped backward, and disappeared into the snow. Hank watched in awe. It wasn't rage driving the horse. It was protection. Dusty soon followed, stumbling at first, but then galloping forward with renewed strength. Side by side, they moved like something out of a dream, or a nightmare, depending on which side you were on. In the chaos, Tommy made a run for the gate, flanking one of the men and knocking him down hard with the butt of the revolver. He turned to his father, yelling, We can't hold them off forever. We have to end this." Hank nodded, eyes never leaving the second man, who was now backing away slowly, hands raised, clearly unprepared for this kind of resistance, from men or horses. Sirens howled in the distance. Blue and red lights began to flicker through the trees. It was Deputy Claire Hartman, finally answering the emergency call Hank had managed to make earlier in the night. Her truck skidded to a halt as two more squad cars followed. The intruders froze. Tommy dropped his weapon. Bandit stopped just feet from the fallen man and stood, breathing hard, staring down like a guardian unwilling to back down. Claire stepped out, gun drawn, eyes wide. "What in God's name happened here?" Hank turned to her slowly, voice gravel-deep and steady. Something that was buried years ago just found its way back to the surface. The property was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was the kind that follows a storm. Heavy, cleansing, final. The sun rose slowly over the snow-covered field, casting a soft golden light over the broken fences and the tired figures scattered across the land. Officers were still questioning the two captured men. Claire stood by the gate, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Inside the barn, Bandit lay beside Dusty, both resting, their chests rising and falling in rhythm. They were safe now. Free. Not just from the chains that once bound them, but from the fear that had lived behind their eyes for so long. Hank stood nearby, leaning on the stall gate, watching them. "They made it," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Tommy entered quietly, a bandage around his hand, his face showing the weight of a man who had finally stopped running. "The feds took Sherman in," he said. "Turns out there's a full investigation opening now." He kept records, a lot of them. He looked at his father. "What happens now?" Hank took a long breath. "Now." He looked at the horses. "Now we start over. We take care of what's been broken. And we don't forget what it cost." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't look away. Tommy stood beside him in silence. There was nothing left to say, not yet. But there was something else between them now. Not forgiveness. Not entirely. But understanding. And maybe that was enough for now. Weeks passed. Snow melted. Spring crept in. Dusty's strength returned little by little, and Bandit never strayed far from his side. Word spread through the town about what happened. People came to visit, quietly, respectfully, some leaving apples at the gate, others just standing in silence. The story of the two horses traveled far beyond Red Hill, sparking questions in places where answers had been buried for years. And one morning, as the sun rose again, Hank stood in the pasture, watching the horses run freely for the first time without chains, without fear. They kicked up dirt and joy like it was the only language they'd ever needed. Tommy stood beside him, eyes wet, but smiling. Hank placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the sky warming above them. "They weren't just saving themselves," he said. "They saved us too."